Tonight's body on the table is the Miami Heat. Time of death, Tuesday night in Charlotte, when the Heat lost 127 to 126 in overtime to the Charlotte Hornets in the 9 versus 10 playing game. The final blow was LaMelo Ball's layup with 4.7 seconds left. The final confirmation was Miles Bridges blocking Davion Mitchell at the buzzer. That was the official ending. That was the moment the season stopped breathing. But this is a postmortem, not a recap. And a postmortem has to tell the truth. The truth is that the Miami Heat did not really die tonight. Tonight was just when the family was finally allowed in the room. Because this season was sick for a while. Miami finished the regular season at 43-39, good for 10th in the East, which is a very Heat kind of record in the worst possible way. Respectable enough to avoid embarrassment, mediocre enough to prove nothing, and flimsy enough that one bad night could erase the whole thing. Charlotte finished at 44-38, one game better, got the home floor, and in the end, that tiny margin turned out to be the difference between still alive and let's start the autopsy. And that's the first finding here. Cause of death was not one collapse. It was chronic middleness. Not tanking, not true contention, just one clear direction. Not one clear direction. Just a team living in the mushy center, surviving on organizational pride, coaching reputation, and the old Heat aura that makes people think they're more dangerous than they actually are. This was their 4th straight trip to the play-in tournament. That sounds gritty at first, until you phrase it correctly. This is 4 straight seasons that they weren't good enough to avoid the side door. That's the thing about the Heat. They're so professionally run that even their decline looks competent. They didn't embarrass themselves easily. They don't feel unserious. Eric Spoelstra is still Eric Spoelstra, and that buys them dignity, structure, and a fighting chance. Miami even closed the regular season with wins over Washington and Atlanta. Just to remind everybody, they still had pulse, rhythm, and self-respect. But a pulse isn't health. It's just evidence that the body's warm. Let's identify the symptoms. First symptom, this roster was unstable before the season even had a shape. The ugliest headline of Miami's year was Terry Rozier. He didn't play a single game this season after his October arrest on federal gambling-related charges. The Heat finally waived him on April 10th. What that means is one of the franchise's major backcourt bets turned into dead salary, dead roster space, and a cloud hanging over the whole enterprise. A serious team can survive one missing piece, but it can't survive forever, paying for certainty and getting chaos instead. Second symptom, the offense was too often conditional. When Miami looked good, it usually looked clever, hardworking, and annoyingly composed. When it looked bad, it looked like a team trying to manufacture enough offense through discipline and effort. And that'll work in patches, but it doesn't always work against real talent, athleticism, or variance. And in a one-game environment, one dry spell is enough to send you to the coroner. The Heat scored enough tonight to survive on paper, but the larger season still tells the same story. Too much strain for too little margin. The third symptom, the old mythology got ahead of the current reality, because this is where Miami is still dangerous. As a brand, the jersey says Heat. The coach is Spoelstra. Bam Adebayo is still a foundational player. Tyler Hero still gives him shot making. Andrew Wiggins still looks like a stabilizer. Davion Mitchell had a huge game tonight. There's enough credible NBA names here. People keep wanting to believe the switch is still there. That's what made the season tricky to diagnose. Miami didn't look dead. They looked like a team that might figure it out. And that's a different illness entirely. Then came the actual game, and it followed the shape of the season. It was chaotic, it was close, and it was annoying. It was survivable right up until the end, when it wasn't. There were 17 ties and 16 lead changes. Bam Adebayo, one of the central pillars of the whole operation, left early after suffering a back injury in the second quarter, after a hard fall during a play involving LaMelo Ball. Miami still kept fighting, which is what Miami always does. Davion Mitchell scored 28. Andrew Wiggins scored 27. Tyler Hero had late moments. They pushed it all the way to overtime. And then, because this season specialized in almost, they lost by 1 point. And honestly, that may be the cleanest ruling of all. Official cause of death, too much dependency on Heat culture, not enough actual advantage. Now, Heat culture is real. I'm not trying to mock it. It's one of the strongest organizational identities in American sports. But culture is supposed to sharpen talent, not replace it. This year, Miami asked Heat culture to do too much. It asked discipline to cover for instability, and it asked coaching to cover for roster holes. Grit can't cover thin margins, and the logo can't scare people longer than the team itself could. To be fair, it almost worked, and that's the most Miami thing imaginable. They were close enough to keep the lie alive. But now let's be fair to the dead. What went right? Spoelstra still kept the thing above water. A worse coach probably drowns with this roster. Miami still finished over 500. They still gave themselves a postseason door. They still competed hard enough that a 1 point overtime loss feels painful instead of inevitable. And that matters. This wasn't a clown season. This was a frustrating season from a serious organization. There's a difference. Okay, what went wrong? And the simplest answer here is they didn't separate from the mush. They weren't awful enough to reset cleanly, and they weren't good enough to command the bracket. They finished behind Charlotte, landed in the 10th spot, meaning they have to win twice just to enter the real playoffs. And they lost the first game, and that's that. In NBA's modern structure, middling teams don't get a long trial. They get one exam and a quick burial. We had a moment of false hope here. It's probably the idea that nobody wanted to see Miami in the play-in. That sentence was a mantra. It's a little ceremonial. Nobody wants to play Miami. It's a little inherited. Maybe once it was fully true, but this year it sounded like people were reciting from memory. Charlotte didn't care. Charlotte just beat them, and that matters. It's one thing to lose to a giant. It's another to be told by a peer, your mystique is expired. So who survives? Spoelstra survives, bam. The organizational seriousness, Heat culture. Even Hero probably survives this conversation because the death certificate here is not one man failed. This is bigger than that. The thing that does not survive is the assumption that Miami can keep living on the edge forever and still call itself threatening. At some point, the edge is not the edge anymore. It's your home address. And that's what this season was, a new home address. So the final ruling for the 2025-26 Miami Heat is this. The Miami Heat died of erosion, not scandal alone, although the Rozier mess was poison, and not injury alone, although losing Bam in the elimination game was brutal. Not bad coaching because, let's face it, Spoelstra remains one of the best ones alive. It wasn't lack of effort because they fought like hell. They died because the gap between dangerous and reputation and actual present-day ceiling, it got too wide to bridge. The Hornets didn't expose a fraud directly. What they exposed was a limit. That's a harsher verdict because limits are harder to romanticize than collapses. A collapse means something broke. A limit means this might be just what you were all along. That's the postmortem of the Miami Heat. They didn't go out soft or stupid. They went out exactly the way that the system had always threatened to end, in a close game, in the play-in, with just enough fight to make the loss feel honorable, just enough evidence to know honor wasn't the issue. The season's over. The body's been identified. The cause of death on file. The next question is the one every postmortem should leave behind. Was this a one-year death, or is this the beginning of decomposition? Thanks for watching. That's it.